had the pleasure of spending time with some very special cars over the years, but nothing has quite turned heads like this. It's been getting so much attention, and especially from other road users and the likes of Land Rover drivers. Even people like Ford Raptor owners have just been giving me the nod of approval when it comes to this vehicle. And that's the interesting thing about the Land Cruiser, because just like the GR Yaris, it's one of those vehicles that if you know, you know, and that to me is very important. I honour that over any flashy Land Rover. I'd rather have something really cool like this, which is just steeped in so much heritage and has all of these quirky elements which have been brought across from the previous generations. Now, what I will say about the Land Cruiser is, as much as I've fallen in love with it, I'm not the target audience for this vehicle. This still has a very thirsty diesel engine, and it's been built for off-road. Not to mention, it's got 7 seats, which we're definitely going to look around the space later on. And I would like to start a petition, and I'm sure that a lot of you would agree. Toyota should build a compact version of this, like Jimny sized. It would sell in the bucket load. Put a hybrid engine in it. Doesn't have to be as good at off-roading. It would still be a benefit, but then it would be so much more accessible. Make it about £30,000 and I would be first in line to buy one. This is possibly just a little bit too big for me. Talking about styling, it does have that really boxy look, which I love. You've got the square wing mirrors, which are very familiar to previous generations of this vehicle, and it's super eye-catching in that pastel blue with the beige roof. And I love the fact that all the old Defender 110s, they all had that different coloured roof, and I think it has that element of nostalgia about it. Around the front, you've got a really chunky square grille. You've got that front grille here with Toyota spelled out across the front, which we haven't seen on Toyotas of recent, but I love that they've brought it across for the 5th generation Land Cruiser. And because this is a first edition, you've got the very cool round headlamps. Unfortunately, if you do buy a Land Cruiser now, you get square headlamps instead of these round ones, which I think is a massive shame. But if you've managed to bag yourself a first edition, I bet you're really, really chuffed. Now, interestingly, I have just been spending time with the GR Yaris, and you wouldn't think that these two cars have much in common. But interestingly, the designers have focused on very similar elements when it comes to the upgrades. And that's making these vehicles long lasting and also working on the customer experience and repair bills and keeping them low. I know, from a manufacturer, seems crazy, right? But it really helps to build that rapport with the customer, and that's why people keep buying Toyotas year after year, because they last. So for instance, on the new GR Yaris, they split up the front bumper to not be in one part, but to be in a few different bits, and they've done the same with the Land Cruiser. So it's now split up into various different elements, meaning that if you are off-road and you happen to damage a part of the vehicle, you've only got to replace that part with the bumper rather than the whole lot, saving the customer money. It's a wild concept, but I hope other people pay attention. And they've done other things, like you've got the fog lights, which are set back into the bumper, and they're covered by this little plastic covering. So when you're off-roading, you're not going to get jabs of things into those lights and break them. They're going to be a lot longer lasting. But one thing they haven't changed when it comes to durability is the engine, because that was very good. You still get the same 2.8 litre 4-cylinder diesel engine. It gets about 200 brake horsepower and between 300 and 400 newton meters of torque. I can't remember exactly how much, but it is enough to tow 3.5 tons, and I think that's where people are going to really want this car, because a lot of people who had things like Hyundai Santa Fe's, which were 7-seaters, they can no longer tow because it's all gone hybrid. There's still definitely a lot of appeal for diesel, and I like the fact that there is loads of choice out there. You can get a more modern petrol. For instance, you can get a petrol in the new Grenadier, but if you want to stick with diesel, I love the fact that Toyota are still doing diesel in this Land Cruiser. It also now features a new 8-speed automatic gearbox, and you can tell that the gearbox has mostly been set up for off-road driving. It really is quite slow on the pickups when you're pulling out of junctions. This is the perfect example. It revs quite highly until it finally decides to change gear. But I'm not sure if this is a gearbox issue or if actually I'm just not used to a diesel anymore. I don't spend too much time with diesels and they do have their own quirks. Of course, they also have benefits, and that is towing and sometimes fuel economy, although the Land Cruiser has been sitting around 30 miles per gallon whilst I've been spending time with it. So it's not exactly the most economical vehicle, not like diesel of the old days. Jumping inside of the Land Cruiser, and I've seen a few reviews saying the interior quality was not quite up to the standard that they expected. But what did they expect? This is an off-road vehicle, a utilitarian vehicle. I know it's £75,000 and that is a lot of money, but it just wouldn't make sense to make it all plush and squashy in here. It's not trying to be a Range Rover. It wants to be something different to a Range Rover. It wants to show that it has that true off-road potential inside and out. And I really love the fact that the interior matches with that really rugged styling of the exterior. For me, these seats are a real highlight, and I think they help soak up some of that not so great ride quality. They're really soft, they've got loads of space. If you're a slightly bigger person, you'll have no problem behind the wheel of this vehicle. It's also very practically laid out. You've got a ton of buttons. We've got a nice large touchscreen and a digital instrument cluster, but underneath this you've got physical climate control dials, loads and loads of charging options. We've got 3 USB-C chargers, a HDMI and some wireless charging as well. You've also got buttons for your rear view camera, as well as many other functions like your heated seats and also cooled seats as well, which when it's been quite warm in March, it's been quite nice just to pop on that cooled seat and quickly cool down this leather interior. So I think that'd be lovely in the summer. Loads of buttons down here which all surround your off-road driving, which I'll talk about in a moment. In terms of storage, that's the only place where I think this vehicle loses out a little bit. Inside this armrest, you've got a really small cubby hole. This is a cool box, which I think is quite handy. So I like the fact that you can keep your cans of Coke nice and cold in there, but only for about 2 people. You're not going to be able to get cans of Cokes for all 7 passengers in here, unfortunately. Cup holders, but again, these aren't the most practical. I would have liked them to have a function which held your cup into place. If you've got a smaller cup like a Red Bull can, it might just roll around. You've got storage inside the doors, but it's not a huge amount and it's quite far down as well. And also when looking inside this glove box, it does feel slightly small for the size of the vehicle. You only have to take a peek to the underside of the Land Cruiser to realise its off-roading potential. You see, just like the Ineos Grenadier, the Land Cruiser sits on a ladder chassis, so it's separate from the main core body of the vehicle. Now, when it comes to this latest generation, the chassis is also up to 50% more rigid, and the body is also about 30% more structurally sound, so it is a lot more rugged. And on top of that, they've also added nearly 12 metres of adhesives, structural adhesives. So overall, it's just a lot tougher than the outgoing version of the Land Cruiser. And it needs to be, because this can do some serious off-roading. And when it comes to going off the beaten track, the Land Cruiser is nearly unbeatable. With the 4-wheel drive low range activated and mud mode engaged, you can activate cruise control. This feature acts like cruise control for off-roading, maintaining a consistent speed that you can adjust in 1 kilometre increments, all the way up to 6 kilometres per hour, simply by turning the drive mode switch. With this setup, the Land Cruiser effortlessly navigates steep slopes and water crossings, leaving you to focus solely on the steering. While hardcore off-roaders may appreciate the manual control of the old Defender, this system offers great confidence for most drivers, whether tackling challenging terrain, deep water or steep, slippery inclines. The Land Cruiser feels more effortless compared to the Ineos Grenadier, while matching the impressive capabilities of the renowned Land Rover Defender. When it comes to the doors, they don't quite open at a 90-degree angle, so not as practical as some large family SUVs, but it does have its added practicality over those SUVs, and that's how high it rides. So if you do have a child seat, whilst you might need to navigate round the doors, once you do get here, it's the perfect height to be able to load those in. I also love the fact that the ISOFIX fitments are just hidden underneath this piece of leather. It helps keep things nice and tidy and stops crumbs from getting in there when you're not using them. To climb inside, you can use the side step, and you also have handles at the top and on the side to help lift yourself in. I don't find it too much of a problem, but if you are worried about small children, I don't think they'll have too much of an issue, as it's quite easy access with those handles and you can just get yourself in quite comfortably. Once inside, it's pretty good. It is slightly small in here, but then again, this driver and passenger seat has been brought quite far forward. As you can see, it's not quite in line with this centre console, of which would give you much more space. You've got a pull-out armrest, which has a couple of cup holders, but nothing particularly fancy. I will say, however, there's loads of light here because it's coming from all around the cabin. You've got these massive windows, you've got the panoramic sunroof as well, and I also love the fact that in the back, you're just sitting a little bit higher, and that means you get a really good view over the road. Even as the backseat passenger, I can see the front of the bonnet. So when it comes to children who may suffer with travel sickness, they will actually find this really good to be able to see out the whole front window. I have access to USB-C chargers, as well as a 12-volt charger, and even heated and cooled seats when it comes to the outer edges, which feels rather fancy. Okay, what about that third row? The Land Cruiser has an extremely easy third row to reach because these seats, at the flick of a switch, flip forward and upwards. You have to be careful though, because I can imagine if you've got small children, that does flip up quite strong on its own. So just be aware that if you have got small children, make sure that only you are using these seats and not letting them use them, because otherwise they could get hurt. So I will crawl inside and bring those seats down and work out how much legroom I have. Now I am going to leave these in this position, otherwise you literally won't see me. In the third row with those seats down, headspace is okay. It's just a little bit lower than some of the other 7-seaters that I've tested recently, but I'm about 5'5", 5'6", and I have just enough headroom. I've also got access to 2 cup holders. I've got access to charging in the back here, so it feels like a really practical space. Now let's put these seats down and forward, and we will see. Yeah. Okay, so that is now in the main position for the second row, and actually I'm still doing pretty good for legroom. Okay, it's a couple of inches, so it's not great, but I can tuck my feet underneath these back seats, which is better than I thought. When I first saw the rear, I thought it was going to be a lot tighter than it actually is. But what about on-road? Because that's what I've been doing for most of the time. Well, it's okay. You can tell that on-road was a bit of an afterthought for Toyota. When it comes to the Land Cruiser, it's all about off-roading. So it's all been set up for that. And then on-road, because you have that ladder chassis, it does mean it has a slightly more twitchy ride at lower speeds. But I don't think that's always a negative. Often with large wafty SUVs, they can make you feel a bit sick because they're so disconnected. This feels a lot more old school. There's a lot more connect, and yes, it is a bit bumpier, but some people may prefer that in a driving style. What I will say is, compared to the Ineos Grenadier, it blows that car out the water with the steering engagement. So the steering in this is an electric steering, and with the Ineos Grenadier, it's more of like an old school approach. I can't remember the exact name, but you have to almost do twice the amount of turns than you do with the power steering in the Toyota. And whilst yes, that can be good for off-roading, it does make it more difficult to live with. And then there's the reliability. If you've been slightly put off by the Ineos Grenadier and all of the problems that come with it, they really did want to play homage to the old Defender, didn't they? Then this could be a much better option. Like I said, Toyota hasn't really tweaked too many things, and that means that its excellent reliability reputation should continue into the 5th generation. There's some interesting things to talk about when it comes to boot space. Firstly, the boot used to be side hinged when it came to the Land Cruiser, and that was a pain because it's such a large vehicle and it made it really difficult for opening up the boot if you were in car parks or busy areas. So now it's much more conventionally hinged from the top. But before we open it and talk about boot space, I want to show you another feature. So it's this button here. Hold down this button and you can actually manually open the top glass part of the tailgate, which I love. If you've got dogs, this is super practical, but even if you're camping in the back of your vehicle, you can open that up, especially on a day like today, and you can look out over the sea. It just makes it easier to live with, and I love these practical little elements. There is a tow hook, and also if you go for a spare wheel, it's no longer loaded onto the back and it doesn't go in the boot, it goes underneath, so you'll just see it peeking through there. Right, let's open up this boot. So inside of the boot you will find just over 560 litres, and that's when you've got all of the 5 seats in place. Your third row is actually electrically adjusted, but what I find a bit of a pain is you do have to hold your finger on the buttons and they take a little while to come up. So I'm just going to stand here and chat to you guys whilst we wait for those to come up. I'm sure that's a safety feature. Nearly there. There we go. And then the headrests are manually brought up like this. And as you can see, once all 7 seats are in place, boot space, yeah, it's almost non-existent. 130 litres, so absolutely tiny. There's no space underneath here to put pretty much anything. That's why the spare wheel has gone underneath there. And you've just got enough space to be able to access the 3-pin charger and to access those electric seat buttons. So if you do have a larger family, if you're going to be carrying 6 or 7 people often, then you're going to need either to have a trailer or to have a roof box, because you're not getting anything in that boot. Everybody knows that I just love a vehicle that has quirkiness, and this has a ton of quirkiness, but what I love about this vehicle is it almost feels like a classic Land Cruiser, then just resto modded. This feels like it plays so much homage to the original Land Cruiser and not like a modern car, and I think that's what I've been enjoying about it so much. Don't get me wrong, it's not perfect, it's compromised on the road, it's not particularly powerful, in fact it does lack quite a lot of power, but just going around town it feels really cool, and you get those nod from other drivers, whether they're in Grenadiers or Land Rovers. You can tell that a lot of people think that this is a very cool car, and I have to agree with them. And unfortunately for me, the Land Cruiser will have to remain as a dream. But if you do have £75,000, you don't want your everyday Land Rover Defender. You need something which is a rugged off-roader but can still carry all of the family. And you just fancy something a bit different and don't mind too much when it comes to quality. Then I think you're going to love the Toyota Land Cruiser, especially if you are up for all of those muddy trails and going off-road, because it's so capable. And to do all of that and still have 7 seats, I really think this is an impressive vehicle. And the thing that stands out to me is this vehicle does its predecessors proud. Many times nowadays, manufacturers are coming out with vehicles which just don't pay homage to their predecessors, but this is something very different. I've loved spending time with this vehicle, and it will just for now remain as a dream until they build that mini Land Cruiser. I really hope you have enjoyed this video today, guys. If you have, please go ahead and give it a big thumbs up. And if you want to see more videos like this, then you're in the right place. Go ahead and hit the subscribe button. Until next time, guys. See you later.